Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about some of these roadmaps that you might see on the internet, and just telling you that if you want to be a backend engineer, front-end engineer, Android developer, or any other kind of software engineers with any categories or direction, that you need to follow these things. And I'm going to talk about what is my takeaway from these roadmaps, and then you can just make a decision based on what you also are coming across. So let's just pick one of them as an example. It's coming from the roadmap.sh, and I'm going to leave the link to this roadmap for the backend engineer also in a video description, and we can just talk about it. There are some also consideration here on the left and also on the right side, but if you're going to talk about backend engineer or backend software engineer, the roadmap starts from here. So we are going to talk about basically the backend, and then coming to the internet, basically it's going to just explain the fundamental and the basic that you need to know. And I would agree with all of them. If you're going to work on any web projects, you need to know minimum of some definitions and fundamentals. For example, you need to know what is DNS, domain name, what is hosting, HTTP, and how does it work, how does the browser work. You need to know basically how does these things works. The more you know, the better, but at least you need to know some basic and fundamentals. So these two, this one and this one, are just basically some of the basic that you might need to know. I would argue that to some degree you might understand by reading theory, but the more you write code and the more you actually just come across of issues, you can understand more and better about these concepts. Because you can read a lot, but the moment that you work with those things, then you're going to just actually feel it and touch exactly those topics and understand what is actually happening. Then we're going to languages. So with the languages, you have a few options. Really depends again what projects and what services you're going to build, and how big is the team size. So you can see you have Go, you have JavaScript, you have Java, C#, PHP, you have Rust on the other hand, and all of these things are very good. So the idea of choosing one of these languages really come back to a lot of factors that you need to consider. If you are just going to learn something, maybe going with a JavaScript would be the best thing, because if you learn JavaScript, you can just use it for the backend, front end. You can later on use it with quite a few other roadmaps. But then if you already know some of these languages, then pick a new one would be a good one. But I would just argue that JavaScript would be a very good choice at this stage, because a lot of jobs and a lot of companies are looking for JavaScript developers. Specifically if you're going to if you want to only learn one language, which is JavaScript, then you can use it for front end. For example, you can use it with Vue.js, Angular, React, or any other things like Next.js. And then for the backend, you can use it with a Node.js. So the moment that you learn JavaScript, you're good to go with backend and frontend. But if you don't want to go with the JavaScript, then we have other options. You really need to look on the job market. You really need to look on your personal interest if you're going to choose a language. And also depends on a service that you're going to build. There are different factors that you need to consider. For example, you can look at the community of that language. You can look at how many packages and open source project exists with that language. You can see, for example, how performant is one language to compare with others, and where you're going to use that language. For example, if you're going to use it with AWS Lambda, some of these languages might not be available there. For example, PHP and Rust at this stage. So you need to really consider and do your exercise before and homework before you're really going to choose a language. For now, I would, for example, say JavaScript is a good one. Go is very good one. If you're going to write a lot of things, Python is very popular, and other things, other languages are also popular, but really depends again. Depends on the job market, depends on a company you're going to work, depends on a project that you're going to work. You can choose these languages. So all of these things are also really come down to the personal preferences, but I would go, for example, to begin with the JavaScript one. From here, you need to work with the version control system. With the version control systems, you have a few options, but Git these days are 99% of projects. So as long as you know Git, then you're just good to go. And then if you're going to work with a Git, you can just also choose any of these things, for example GitHub, GitLab and Bitbucket, but all of them are okay and good. But if you choose GitHub, then you can have different options, and you can see again most of the companies and projects are hosted in GitHub, so they put their repositories in GitHub. So probably I would go with the GitHub as well. Moving on, so then we are going to know about the repo hosting services, which is here. Then from here we're going to OS and general knowledge. So as a backend engineer, you need to know some fundamentals and some theories behind the operation system and general knowledge of what is happening there. You can see, for example, now it's picking up the terminal. So again, yes, you need to know terminal. Very specifically, most of the services are run on a Unix based, so you need to know some sort of shell scripting or bash scripts, and then in some cases you might need to know PowerShell. But if you know, for example, the Unix based command, then you're almost good to go. And there are some basic terminal commands that you need to know. I think it doesn't matter that if you're backend or frontend, you are going to some degree work in terminal, and you need to feel comfortable using some of these commands. And they're not really very difficult to learn, they're just quite easy, and the moment you learn them, you can just have them in your toolbox for the rest of your life and rest of your career. And then some of these things also, you can see them in a list. So how does OS work in general, what's happening in operation systems, and then memory management, processors, communication, IO management, networking concept, threads and concurrency. At least you need to know what are they. You might not write some applications which needs multi-threads, but at least if you know the concept, you're not going to be completely blind when someone is talking about this stuff. Or you might not directly work with the memory, but when you're going to write some codes, it's better to know the concept so that your application or your service that you're going to build is not really going to consume a lot of memories, which is going to along the line is going to impact your performance. So as long as you know the concept, I assume you're good to begin with. Later on, you need to know a lot more. Going back again here, after OS, it's coming to the database. Really, when it comes to the database, you have two choices. You are going to use NoSQL databases or relational databases. With the relational databases, pretty much most people have worked or to some degree are familiar with the MySQL, but as long as you know SQL language, then you are quite okay with choosing one of these flavors. So if you're going to use Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB, MS SQL, Oracle, you are quite okay. Just try to learn SQL and then you're good to go. Depends on your project, you can choose any of them. But if you're going to build something for scaling, then Postgres would be a better option, and it's going to be supported in most clouds. And then we are talking about the NoSQL databases. NoSQL databases are quite different in that sense. They could be document based, or they could be time series, or it could be quite different things that you can see. So really depends on what you're going to build. You need to pick one. So for example, MongoDB is quite popular these days, so you can choose MongoDB, or which is here. Or if you're going to use one of the Google solution, Firebase is actually very good. Cassandra, I've heard quite a lot about it. Redis is quite popular if you're going to introduce caching in your system, or if you want to use in-memory databases. And then DynamoDB is very popular as well if you're going to work on AWS. So really this list is going to give you like an idea of what you need to choose. I would again argue that you don't need to know all of them. As long as you know the fundamental, as long as you have the foundation, then picking a database later on would be an easy job. So you need to know what is happening, for example, in a relational database, and what is the word like in non-relational database or NoSQL database. And in that sense, if you know it, then picking, for example, MongoDB or moving from MongoDB to DynamoDB is not going to be a very difficult migration. So at least for you to just pick the new technology. It's not going to be so much different. So I would say just learn the fundamental, then the rest would be easy. It's important to know, for example, what are these terminology means as well. So the more you know about these things, the better you can design and choose your service. Depends on the problem that you're going to solve, depends on a system that you're going to build. These databases and these problems and these decisions are going to help you to choose the right tools. I will move on to the database knowledge. So if you can see about databases, you might just encounter a scaling database. So you need to be familiar with some of these concepts. In today's world, you're going to build a lot of APIs. Most services are communicating with each other with APIs. And then if you're going to just build APIs, you need to know some certain things. For example, you need to know about GraphQL, you need to know about gRPC, you need to know about REST API, which is very popular, and majority of APIs are at the moment are in REST. So you need to just know the concept, you need to know how does it work. The language used in REST API, for example, when they're talking about status codes, when they are talking about the webs and how you're going to name your API, versioning your API, all of these things are coming here. And that depends on the service that you're going to build. Very likely there will be some APIs as well in the requirement. And then when it comes to the APIs, you also need to know about the security, which is authentications. With authentications, you might going to use OAuth, you might use token auth, JWT, basic authentications, and a few more you can see here. That really depends, again, what your API is going to be used for. You can choose a different authentication for that as well. You might end up also using OpenAPI spec to generate the documentation and also just communicate this documentation with others. So really going to use this one as well. Then moving on, we're going to caching here. So we are in a caching. So depends where you're going to put your cache. Again, you have different options. As I said here previously, you have Redis, you have Memcache, and then depends where you're going to put your cache. If it's in a client side, you are going to use different things. If the cache happens on a server side, you have different options, which is Redis and Memcache, or if you're going to cache it in a CDN level. So that's also possible as well. And then moving on, we're going to web security. So with the security, you're going to just hash your important data or encrypt your data, and you need to know some of the algorithm in this case. And you can just see some here, but there are a lot more, and you need to be comfortable at least understanding them and then choose the right one for your service. Then we're coming to testing. So testing is a very important part of every system that you're going to build. As pretty much you might know, that later on it will cause a lot of pain if you skip testing. So with the testing, you need to know testing pyramid, you need to know the importance of every element in a testing pyramid, unit test, integration test, end-to-end test, regression test, contract testing, load testing, stress testing, quite a lot of them. You don't need all of them at the beginning, but to begin with, you need to introduce enough tests to have confidence when you're going to release and deploy new changes. So make sure you're just also comfortable with the testing concept as well when you're going to work as a backend engineer. It doesn't matter really what level you're just going to write code, testing will be always part of the development. And then next thing, we will come to the CI/CD. With the CI/CD, which is very important to choose, for example, a tool that is going to help you. If you remember on the top, we were talking about GitHub and GitLab, for example, and GitHub. So these two, and even a few more services providing CI/CD, I wouldn't be worried at this stage too much. But if you're going to use, for example, GitHub Actions is going to give you pretty much everything, and you're going to choose one tool which is providing most of the solutions for you. So with the CI/CD, you can just choose, for example, GitHub. And then moving on, we are going to talk about the design and development principles. So with the design principles and design patterns, you need to be quite confident with some of the important design patterns. You wouldn't necessarily need to know all of them because you might not even use all of them, but it's good to know some of them in hand and just start using them if it makes sense and if it's going to benefit you. And also there are some different jargons and also terminologies like DDD, domain-driven design, test-driven design, or TDD, CQRS, event sourcing, and a few more that will come handy if you just know them. Not necessarily they're going to solve all the problems that you have, and also it really depends on what size of applications you're going to build. You can choose some of them, but these are good things to also be at least aware, even if you're not going to use them. And then we're going to architecture patterns. There are more here. We can see, for example, microservices, which is most projects these days could or should be microservices instead of using monolith. Depends again what service you're going to build. You can choose them, but with the microservices, for example, you're going to decouple, you're going to write tests, you're going to deploy easier, you're going to have quite a few benefits. With monolith, you're going to have again some other pros and some cons as well, but you need to work on some of them and understand them. But if you're going to pick, for example, one, microservices would be a very good one. But to begin with, I would just say, for example, if you know microservices, if you know serverless, and then if you're familiar with the monolithic apps, then that's good to know. That's good to move on. And then you also need to know about your search engines. So there are a few more things that you might need to know. For example, queue and topics. So you can use RabbitMQ. You can, if you're using AWS, you have SQS and SNS, but you need to know the concept of queues. And then for data streaming, then Kafka, for example, would be a good one as well. And then we have a few more options on the right side. So if you're going to use containers, Docker would be a very good one. Kubernetes is actually going to help as well so much. And then as we talk about, for example, those databases and the type of APIs, then depends, for example, you can use GraphQL as a data layer on top of all your APIs to actually solve a lot of problems. And you can see some of them here. WebSockets, yes, you need to know them if you're going to have the use case. If not, then it's different. Then it comes to the web services on the left side here. You have quite a few options. These days, depends on the service and the projects that you're going to use. For example, if you use serverless, you might not end up using any of them. For example, in the AWS world, if you're going to use Lambdas, API gateways, you might not end up using any of them. Maybe behind the scene, they're using some of these web servers, but to begin with, you might not need even to just bother with them. But if you're going to use some of them, the very, very important ones at the moment are Nginx, Apache, and then Microsoft IIS or MSIS. And then as long as you know one of them, the concepts are pretty much the same everywhere, and fundamentals are not going to change, to be honest, that much. And then I'm going to just move on to the building for a scale. One thing about the backend services are scalability, and you really need to be careful about and be ready to scale if the huge traffic is coming to your service. And then you can see, for example, you need to know about the back pressure, you need to know about load shifting, you need to know about throttlings and a few more things. So just read about them and understand, and also be ready to just make sure your system, and be ready to auto scale in case that your system is going to receive a lot of things. And again, really depends on what architecture you're going to use. You might not have some of these problems. If you're going to use serverless, for example, then all of these problems are much easier to solve than if you're going to use different types of architecture. And then if you're going to have some sort of database or the system, if you need to do migration, you need to be careful. If you're going to scale, you need to know what different type of scaling is important. And then coming back to, again, this side, you need to be careful about when you build a system, you need to be able to observe it, and you need to have some sort of visibility on them. And also when it comes to the observability, you need to have metrics, you need to have logs, you need to have traces to make sure if something goes wrong, you should be ready as well. So basically this list is actually going through quite a lot of things. Doesn't mean you need to know all of them. I don't think so. And I don't know all of them because sometimes you may not come across of any of these terminologies or these technologies, because on the projects and the companies and the services you're going to build might not need any of them, but at the very least you need to know the concept, because if you know the concept, later on if you're going to design for that solution, you know different concept and you can choose the right one. So this is one which I'm going to leave the link again in a video description. There is one more similar concept also you can see on the internet, which now I have got it from the Byte Go website, which again the original of this Backend Burger is coming from another engineers in the LinkedIn. So if you look at this one, for example, they're again talking about some of these concepts in a backend engineer. So let's pick the first one, container. With a container, really depends. You might not even need to do any containers, but if you're going to learn something, maybe Docker would be a good one. Again, depends what size of project and what team size you're going to work on. You might not even need it. With the CI/CD, I would go with the GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is going to give you pretty much everything. You don't need to be worried about anything else. With architecture patterns, again, really depends what you're going to build and how much of work and infrastructures and expertise you have in that area. All of these things are absolutely valid and really depends on problems that you're going to solve. API, a REST API is pretty much going to give you most of the results. REST API is much easier in terms of scaling. It's much easier in terms of really debugging and improvement and performance. But then again, you have GraphQL and TRPC. Then we're going to version control. Version control, you're going to use GitHub, because if you have GitHub here and then you have GitHub Actions, why not to choose one tool? And then when it comes to caching, really again depends where do you want to put your caching. So you might put your caching in a CDN level, you might use browser caching, Redis, Memcache. All of them are valid and all of them are good one. And then with the testing, depends again, defining a confident level in your testing. You can just write different type of tests: integration, unit, functional, end-to-end, performance, contract, regression, and all of these things. We're talking about frameworks. Frameworks are really coupled with the language that you're going to choose. For example, you can see Next.js and Express. As long as you know Node.js or JavaScript, they are good. But then if you want to use a different language, then you need to choose a different framework. But these days, if you know Express or Next.js, you are quite sorted in a JavaScript world. Then when it comes to the database, it really depends on what type of data you're going to store and how you're going to query them and what is your access patterns. So we have, for example, here MongoDB, we have Firebase, we have Cassandra. If you're going to use serverless relational database, then Aura would be a very good one. Postgres is very good one as well, that you can use MySQL, MS SQL. None of them are good or bad, but it really depends what you want to learn. Then you can pick one and just move with that one. Depends on a problem that you're going to solve, depends on performance, depends on your access patterns, depends on the knowledge of the team that you're working with. Then you can just pick one. Then it comes to the languages. With the languages, really again, how much time you have to learn and what do you want to learn and what do you want to get from it. The job market is very important. The company and the job you're going to apply are very important. But if it's a personal choices, then it's completely up to you. Some are very good with the web, some are just better with it, like for example multi-threading. Some are very good with different concepts. Depends again what you're going to build. You can just pick a language. But because here we're talking about, for example, JavaScript, then if you use JavaScript and TypeScript, then you're going to be sorted, and also you can use it for front end as well. So at this stage, you can see I've talked about these two diagrams. So one here is the Backend Burger and the roadmap for the backend engineer here. It's really up to you which one do you want to choose and how you want to approach them. But one thing that you need to know is that you don't have to learn all of them. I don't know all of them, and I don't think if I will ever work with all of them. And also changing the concept of these technologies, languages, and all of these things quite often is not going to give you enough time to be professional and to understand and have a deep understanding about these technologies. So make sure you choose one or choose a few and then be professional and have a very good understanding about each of them and then continue from there. So I'm going to leave the link to these two diagrams in the video description so you can use them. So at this stage, I think this is enough talking about these technologies and languages. By now, you can just see what was my opinion about these technologies and roadmaps and list of these things that you need to learn as a backend engineers. And you can just pick the one which is more relevant to you, relevant to the project that you're going to work on, relevant to the job market that you're already in, and then you can choose a good one. So thank you so much. Please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.